Greetings from LA, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journeys, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2024. And that brings us to a title which has been designated by Criterion at spy number 1227. And this is a work which is described as being from the year 1983. And the name of the filmmaker is Paul Brickman. And the name of the work is Risky Business. This is the work from 1983, and this is from the writer and director Paul Brickman, and this is produced by Steve Tisch and John Avnet, with music by Tangerine Dream. And with regard to the members of the cast, the people who appear in this, the actors who appear in this work, we have, for example, we have so many people here. Curtis Armstrong, Bronson Pinchot, Joe Pantoliano, and starring Rebecca De Mornay and Tom Cruise in this work, which is, again, from the early 80s, 83. In many ways a kind of a perennial 80s classic, and then some, for reasons which I'll try to express and comment upon throughout the course of today. And the film is, of course, Risky Business. Risky Business is arriving in the Criterion Collection physical media catalog, courtesy here of this release in 2024. Excuse me. We have this 4K UHD plus Blu-ray combo edition, and what we have too is in one release we have what is referred to as the theatrical release of the film. And then also what is referred to as a director's cut or director's version of this film. And there are some noticeable differences between the versions. In particular, and I won't go into too many details about it, but in particular, the way that the film ends. Each version has a different way in which it resolves the story between and among our characters. So that is, among many things, I think one of the things that is very exciting about this Criterion Collection release, that we have the availability of these different versions, and they're each in their own way quite excellently presented in terms of presentation, which we'll also get into a little bit later. Before I get into any more discussion of the film, I should say that I'm a child of the 80s. So I was born in 79, but I grew up in the 80s, so I was a child of the 80s. And while I was never able to watch this film, Risky Business, in the theater, I mean, this was released in 1983, so I would have been, 3 years old, 4 years old or so at the time of its release, so it wouldn't have been possible for me to go to the theater to see it. But I did catch up with it a little bit later. I mean, it was an 80s film. It was a kind of famous 80s film. It was in the air. It was a legend. And the local video store that I would go to, had this on a video release when it was then released. And then it had Tom Cruise. And this scene, became very famous and quite ubiquitous. Even to someone like me, as just a young boy growing up and trying to watch as many movies as I could, before I was able to watch Risky Business, I didn't know the story, but I knew of the scene and I knew of Tom Cruise. And so it became this in my head, it became this film that was already having scenes that were ubiquitous and quite legendary. And also in my head, I was thinking, maybe it's an adult themed film. It has risque content or something. It's something like that. So in many ways, it became a kind of a legendary '80s film that when I eventually was able to catch up with the film and watch it on VHS when I was a little bit older, but still growing up. It was really a fascinating experience. A lot of the scenes and a lot of the points went over my head, and I was not able to grasp. I was not able to grasp all of the considerations that are, I think, definitely there and then some. And even now, in my old age, I can't claim to be able to say that I have caught every single point upon watching this. So a lot of things still go over my head. I mean, that's true also for any other film, I should say, upon my watch of it and rewatch of it. But that being said, there is a kind of visceral thrill that I feel whenever I think about um, 80s films that just have this kind of kick. They're just those 80s films titles that seem to be part of the, I don't know what one might call it, that 80s film sort of pantheon of landmark classic film status, and they can range from all sort of walks of life and all and across genre boundaries and lines. But Risky Business for me is definitely up there. I mean, it's the same. I mean, I'm sure maybe someone's list might be different, either on the periphery or in the core. But for me, I mean, it would fall in line with maybe a grouping of films that included, I don't know, films such as like Risky Business and I don't know, Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Back to the Future. I mean, it's in that way, it has a huge sort of landmark status. I mean, it oozes 80s feeling and aesthetic in ways which I think are very important and very poignant. And I'll try to express a little bit about why that is. But and I think it's in that way as well as other ways very invigorating a watch. But it's also it's a very entertaining story. It's very funny. A lot of laugh out loud moments, and I think the humor stands up very, very well. It hasn't negatively dated the film, and there's this sense of teen angst and awkwardness and this type of adolescence and puberty. And growing up into a curiosity about sex and sexuality, and also the idea of feeling liberated and free. The parents are away, and so we have the son, the teenage son. So the Joel character portrayed by Tom Cruise, being alone in the house in a sort of well-to-do neighborhood. And what is he going to do? And with college entrance pressures looming, will he or won't he be able to get into Princeton? And also, what is he going to do in terms of his life and things that are occupying his time in high school, which allows him for this type of possibility of sort of high school sponsored projects that involve thinking of some kind of business entrepreneurial spirit. His friends want to think of a project in order to try to excel at some kind of business entrepreneurial enterprise, thus maybe getting good grades in this particular field of study at high school, but also perhaps setting the path or some kind of, or perhaps establishing some kind of work ethic or ethos that is also embedded in a kind of 80s spirit. And in that discussion, a lot of things that come up are like the drive towards a kind of capitalist ethic, the roots of a sort of capitalistic drive, and meeting demand with supply, with a product that is well marketed. I mean, this is the essence, or one of the essences of Risky Business, that are in the hands of these teenagers. And then what is the root causes of this? What are the sort of psychological implications? If we're talking about the 80s and the early 80s, what is the sort of maybe macro implication with this via or in the context of uh, uh, 1980s American capitalist Reaganomics, and then what of the work product or the subject matter on display, that is the thing or service being sold, and how does that have an impact on our young entrepreneurial spirited main characters or protagonists. And we have a number on this. I guess I'm already going into a kind of plot or story structure quite without any kind of break, so I apologize. So let's just go right into it. So what of this? What is the subject at hand? Well, this is all coinciding with a kind of sense of newfound freedom, albeit maybe temporarily. So Tom Cruise's Joel, who is a high school student, sort of wealthy area of Chicago, suburb area of Chicago, Illinois. His parents are away, and already it's a large house. It's a beautiful house, and already at the very beginning, Joel, the Tom Cruise character, is expressing to us, the viewers, and also to everyone else, his carnal desires, his sex drive, his libido, and so he is, oftentimes thinking about how is he going to fulfill or scratch this itch, in a manner of speaking. And so this goes into a part of the film which is maybe which can be described as a kind of teenage sex comedy, which I think is I mean, I love the teenage sex comedy genre. I mean, there's a lot of camaraderie, and there's a lot of reverie, and there's a lot of hijinks that also allows for the maybe exploration or a critique of high school, Americana high school living and high school life. You get some of the shots in the classroom and teachers and students, and then also the student to student dynamic, and also what of dating, what of sex, what of sexual matters. And then therein lies the through a certain set of plot machinations, we understand that Joel is able to get into contact with an escort, a sex worker, and therein lies the basis for the initial meeting between our two main characters, one being Tom Cruise's Joel, and then the other being Lana. And this is portrayed by Rebecca De Mornay, and they have a very memorable first encounter, and then that forms the sort of the kernel of their ongoing sort of blossoming relationship. That is another sort of guiding rail of this film, Risky Business. And it's through that relationship, and also a kind of maybe trust or lack of trust. I mean, there's a situation involving a kind of glass egg or a prop that has a certain value, and that leads our Joel character to want to know more about Lana. It's not just what is the one night stand situation, but there is an almost financial based impulse that the characters have in order to get to know each other or to pursue each other further. And it could be mutual as well. But I say financial based impulse. There isn't just a financial based impulse, but there's also the way in which that is intertwined, if at all, with a kind of emotional connection. I mean, that's the great gift of this film, Risky Business. Which is that it's able, I think, to really call into question, or at least allow us to consider what is the connection between something that is being pursued because of financial means, something that is either purely transactional, like, let's say, sex work, as an example, is it something that's purely transactional, something that is done in exchange for consideration or monetary consideration that's exchanged in return for a service to be performed. And is that the be-all, end-all of that kind of connection? And or is there then some means by which, or some way by which there can be as well some form of emotional connection alongside with, or perhaps inherent to the transactional activity? And I think that's the very basis of, or one of the bases of risky business is the idea of, if you think about that and expand it to a consideration of how capitalism is handled in the hands of these sort of entrepreneurial high school students, who have this maybe drive to want to create a kind of successful business model in the form of a homemade brothel, then what you have here is a sense of, how far are these people willing to go in terms of business partners, and then what is the psychological implication placed upon them, both immediate in terms of what will happen if the parents find out, how will the assets be protected, will things be damaged, what if the prized father's possession of the Porsche gets damaged, what will he do? So that kind of hijinks adds a sort of direct flavor to the film, thus making for, I think, really entertaining moment to moment, as I say, hijinks, sex comedy romp action, which I think is very, very entertaining and very well developed, and it's a key part of the success of the film. But also we see how this is having a psychological toll on our characters, both on our main character of Joel and also on the other main character of Alana. And whether or not there is a basis for a foundational relationship, and if so, what is the foundation of that, and is it long lasting? And the reason why I say that is, if it has a kind of the argument being, if it's coming from something that is purely transactional, then is there any hope for a kind of longevity beyond, say, the parameters of the film? Or is it the fact that something is transactional in the nature of, say, 80s Reaganomics? Is there something that we can say is fundamentally inherent in the culture that's being expressed? Something that is just an expression of who we are or who they are, which I think is also a very profound possible interpretive statement to this. And I think that also goes into, and I don't want to go into too many specifics about the ending for the benefit of those who haven't seen either version or both versions of Risky Business, but I think depending on which version you watch, the director's cut version or theatrical version, the way it ends, each version ends respectively. There are, I think, implications and possibilities that can take, if you follow this line of thought, it can take you to one conclusion or another conclusion, again, depending on what version you watch, which I think is quite fascinating. Again, the overlap, if anything, between the psychological and purely transactional, and you take a step back and look at it in a macro view, you see it has a sort of a broad-ranging implications. And also, too, there's a kind of currency about that, a relevance, too. I mean, this is a film that was set in the early 1980s, Chicago suburb, and also Chicago urban center as well. I mean, there's a sort of overlap to that as well, which I find very fascinating. But there's a way too in which this film could be said to be also about that entrepreneurial drive, which is even ever present in the now 2024, if one thinks of, say, independent business models that are being created in terms of new sales models of purchase of goods or services, say, over the internet, social media, what is being commodified and what's being sold, and who is doing this. It's oftentimes we find young entrepreneurial people who want to start a new business, and what goes into that, and how is that being marketed, and the kind of excitement and drive, and ultimately what are the background human relationship dynamics that have either supported that business model's success or have perhaps gone against the business model's success. So all this is kind of fascinating and has a kind of a ring of authenticity that remains, I think, very sharp even now in 2024. So this is a really exciting film in that department, and it's also very exciting for a number of other reasons. So, for instance, the set pieces and design and the sort of look and aesthetic of the film, it's really quite wonderful. I mean, there is a suburban domesticity in a lot of these scenes that I think is very well applied, and in some of the shots it's almost turned on its head in a way that almost creates, in some instances, almost like a film noir lighting scheme, the way sometimes that light is shone through windows of the blinds or the shades of a window of a bedroom, or sometimes when characters are in a living room and then suddenly it just turns into this like almost musical produced grand statement. I mean, there's a scene involving when Lana and Joel first meet, and they have a very intimate sort of sexual encounter. But the whole thing about the lighting and the poses and the doors open in the background and the wind blowing and it becomes almost this huge musical number in a way. So there's a lot of heavy stylization in the scenes that I think is very, very well applied. And then too, there's a way that the camera, I think, in a wonderfully, sometimes even maybe on purpose, sometimes in a very anonymous way. But I think that's one of the gifts of this film. The style is sometimes very much evident, but also very much not evident. And even in either mode, I think it's artistically quite successful. I mean, there are moments where you have the camera just being quite static and the characters are talking and they can leave the frame and then come back into the framing. I mean, this is actually, come to think of it, it is quite bold and experimental, considering this is a film that is an output of early 80s Hollywood machine. I mean, this has a lot of camera work and design that could be said to be quite nouvelle vague and quite experimental, even if it feels it still feels within a kind of a Hollywood machinery, which itself I think is very important. And then this is also, I think, given great promise and prominence in a number of very famous set pieces. I mean, there's a set piece a little bit later on in the film involving our two main characters and the train, and Phil Collins' music, which is very memorable. And also, speaking of music, the soundtrack by Tangerine Dream is one of the best. It has that great pulse of minimalism and prog rock and synthesizers and a kind of 80s beat to it, which is very, very cool and gives it a lovely, warm 80s feel. And is just right. It's just warm enough, and it's also just cool enough too. So it's perfect, perfect. And then what are some of the other pieces? I should say too. There's a very, very famous set piece um, that's at the sort of the beginning of the film. And we have a sequence, or the shot here with Tom Cruise alone in the house, just essentially just uh, going nuts off of his newfound freedom and liberation, while just playing music loudly, just being quite kinetic on the sofa, which I always get a kick out of seeing now. I think after the fact, Tom Cruise as a superstar. I mean, he's had his interesting moments with, let's say, his public displays of affection and sofas. So it's interesting to hear, to see him, his character, kind of go wild on the sofa like this. But the point is that it's a very, very, very famous, iconic scene, and this is an example of how this film is really capturing iconic moments and images as part of its film. And it's oozing this 80s style and also cementing itself as a kind of emblem of this the visual look and feel, while also which is great on a surface level, and it's doing wonders on that level, on a surface level, and on a sonic level. And then in terms of the thematic concerns, as I mentioned before, sort of the interplay, if any, and perhaps the dangerous terrain, if any, or sort of the cynicism or optimism, whatever the case may be, that overlap between transaction and emotion. And the entrepreneurial drive, all the while telling the story of Joel and Lana. And speaking of which, the performances here, I think across the board, are really quite something. They're very famous, and in many ways, they're sort of superstar establishing turns. And so, I mean, we have to mention, for example, I mean, there are a lot of people that I'm sure those who know 80s cinema and 80s TV will recognize a number of the faces, a lot of the faces, or 70s and 80s cinema and TV, you'll recognize a lot of the people that appear here. People like Nicholas Pryor, or Richard Mazur, or Joe Pantoliano, or Bronson Pinchot, Curtis Armstrong, and others. And then we have to say about our two leads. So Rebecca De Mornay, it's one of the this is a really standout performance. Rebecca De Mornay films. I mean, when I grew up a little bit, came a little bit later, but Rebecca De Mornay uh, just huge name, especially it's, during a period of years. Like one of the films that I really loved as a kid growing up was. I don't know if does anyone remember the film The Hand That Rocks the Cradle? Does anyone remember that one? I thought that's a great one. That's a great Rebecca De Mornay film. But in any event, yes, I knew of Rebecca De Mornay, but I didn't realize that this film Risky Business in many ways was sort of her star-making turn. So I kind of, as I say, I caught up with Risky Business, the film, on VHS, but after the fact. But when I put the puzzle pieces together, I said, "Oh my goodness, this is the film starring Rebecca De Mornay." When I made that realization, it was like a huge epiphany, and I mean, it's standout. It's really quite amazing. There is a boldness to her character Lana, and there is this drive that also uh, either displays or maybe betrays, depending on how you view it, a sense of unease and vulnerability as well. That I think it's really quite powerful. I mean, her character is so key to the success of the film. So Rebecca De Mornay's performance is a standout. And then, last but certainly not least, we have to give voice to the great Tom Cruise here. This is also a star-making turn for Tom Cruise, who is already on the sort of acting scene, the movie film acting scene. By the time this was released, of course, so it wasn't his debut per se, but it was the film that really catapulted him into superstardom orbit, and for good reason. I mean, he is charming, he is sensitive, he is at times a young adolescent boy who is horny, who is curious about sex, who is curious about freedom, and unsure about what he's going to do. As I say, is he or is he not going to go to Princeton? What's going to happen to the egg? How is he going to handle what's going to happen with his dad's car? Are his parents going to find out before they come home? What's he going to do if his house gets wrecked, etc. All this stuff. So all that teen angst boiled up in a performance that's really great, and he's able to capture that pressure cooker feel on the one hand, but also trying to maintain a certain sense of control on the other. It's really great. While also expressing a kind of exuberance of youth on the cusp of a kind of unknown universe of adulthood. While all the way just looking like he's having a good time every single step of the way. And that's, I think, the greatness of Tom Cruise. He's been in a lot of films, but one of the things that's so great, or perhaps one of the defining features, at least from my point of view, is that you can always tell that he is enjoying himself immensely. And in every film, he throws himself into his roles quite physically. The physicality of his roles is really something. I mean, in many ways, his physicality reminds me in a lot of ways of people like, I don't know, like Charles Chaplin, or Jackie Chan in a lot of ways, especially in his action adventure films, his action films like Mission Impossible, etc. But you see it even from his his early beginnings, like Risky Business and other films. I mean, you really get this energy that is he knows when to turn the valve on and off depending on the needs of the story and the character. So really quite iconic. So, and then all under the writing and guidance direction of Paul Brickman, the great Paul Brickman, and we'll hear more about Paul Brickman and hear from Paul Brickman in some of the supplements that are included with this Criterion release. So, Risky Business is one of the great '80s films. It's one of the great films, and it was a lovely surprise to hear that it would be part of the physical media collection of Criterion, and here we are at the tail end of 2024, and we're able to talk about this film again. And it's such a joy to watch. So this is the film, which is Risky Business. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Risky Business, on this 4K UHD plus Blu-ray combo edition of the film. This is what I have here. This is a two-disc set, or two-disc release. One is the 4K UHD disc with the film and commentary track, which we'll talk about momentarily. And then the Blu-ray, which is the second disc, the Blu-ray disc, which has the film and an optional commentary track with supplements as well. So let's talk about the supplements and commentary track a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about the presentation of the film. I have here the fold-out poster, which is the insert with the poster art on one side, and in the back you have essay and information about the Criterion release. I'm not a fan of I like the poster, but I'm not a fan of the poster fold-out insert design for reasons I'll speak about a little bit later. But it says on one of the columns on the back of this poster fold-out about the master. It says, and I quote, "Risky Business is presented in the aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. Supervised and approved by director Paul Brickman and producer John Abnett, the new 4K restorations of the director's cut and the original theatrical release were created from the 35mm original camera negative and a 35mm interpositive. The 5.1 surround soundtrack was remastered from the original magnetic tracks. The feature is presented in Dolby Vision HDR high dynamic range on the 4K Ultra HD disc and high definition SDR standard dynamic range on the Blu-ray." Okay, so I should point out that this is indicating the restorations of the director's cut and then the theatrical release. And both theatrical release and director's cut are available on the 4K UHD disc if you put it in the player, or the Blu-ray disc if you put it in the player. So you have your choice of watching either or, regardless of the disc format. So HDR, SDR. So that's a really cool feature. Now, I know this film has undergone a number of home media releases prior to this Criterion release, and I know there's always been a lot of talk about, especially in more recent releases prior to Criterion's, about what the theatrical cut does versus what the director's cut does, especially, as I mentioned, how the films or the release versions or the versions end respectively. And I should say that they do have different tenors of ending. The tone is quite different. And so, but to have, I'm very impressed that we have both versions available in one release like this, and each is quite pristine and wonderful and beautiful looking, which I really appreciate. I like how these are restorations of both versions, and to my eye anyway, I should say that there isn't any discernible, say, quote unquote, dip in quality, end quote, if you say go from one version, say the director's cut, over the other, the theatrical version. So I like that. I like how there's sort of a preservation, at least to my discernible eye. There's a presentation or preservation of a kind of equality of restorative vigor. So I'm very appreciative of that. So it doesn't makes the choice of the viewer, if one wants to make that choice as to what version one prefers, I think it makes it an even more level of a playing field, which I find I appreciate very much. In other words, it really puts it in the hands of the viewer and relies on the viewer and trusts the viewer to make the best decision for themselves, which I think is, at the end of the day, really quite excellent indeed. And then as for the way that they look and sound, I'm again, from my very subjective and very limited expertise perspective, I'm say that I'm really quite taken with this, very much so. I haven't owned this film before, so I've seen it a number of times, but I haven't owned it. So, my understanding and my knowledge of the prior releases is quite shallow at best. But I like how it still feels, there's a way in which 80s films have a certain kind of, not all the time, but every once in a while you get a feel of the haziness. There's a haze or a gauze of the 80s feel, which I find quite memorable. I mean, in this film, there's a lot of mist, and there's some scenes involving steam and showers, and also a kind of fog over the nighttime horizon, over, on a dock overlooking a body of water with the sparkling lights of Chicago in the distance or something like that. And I like how that feeling is preserved. It doesn't feel overly produced. It doesn't feel overly restored. I don't know if that's a phrase, but I like how there's a kind of fine sense of excuse me, fine sense of balance. And also, I played it on my very simple setup of a sound system, not in this room, but in the larger TV in the slightly better equipped. It's not the best equipment in the world, but it's a slightly better equipped sound system that I have in another room, the living room, and it sounded really great in both versions too. So, um, I'm very impressed. I'm very, very happy with this, and it it. It felt again, from my subjective experience, it felt just right. It didn't feel like overly uh, color tuned in one area or another. It didn't feel noticeably out of whack or out of sync. Not in terms of overly pink or overly, I didn't feel anything of the sort. At least I didn't detect it. But it still kept that great sense of of 80s hazy neon, which I think is a kind of just right feel, at least for me, when I watch this. So, just my 2 cents with regard to the great release here from Criterion of Risky Business. And now what I've done is I've taken out the 4K disc and I've put in the Blu-ray disc, which is behind me over my shoulder here. I hope you can see it on the monitor. It's a little bit far, maybe out of focus, so I apologize for that. I don't mean to. Why? I guess I can't help it, but my my I'm no Scorsese. I'm no Paul Brickman when it comes to YouTube making videos. So I apologize for that. I should really consider my mise en scène with more particularity, but oh well, c'est la vie. Sorry about that. I'm doing my very best though. But in any event, uh, uh, what I have is in the Blu-ray player. I have the Blu-ray, which has the films or the two versions of the film, director's cut and theatrical release, and then the supplements. Because as we know, the supplements will be found on the Blu-rays. But actually, before we get to the supplements themselves, I should make some comments about the commentary track. The commentary track will be made available on the 4K UHD disc and also on the Blu-ray disc, so whatever you prefer. But I should point out that the commentary track is with regard to the theatrical release. The theatrical release is the one where we had the commentary track associated with it as its option. So when you watch the theatrical release, that's where you can turn on the commentary track option, if you will. And according to what we have here on the Criterion Collection submenu, it says, and I quote, "This commentary track, recorded for the theatrical release in 2008, features producer John Abnett, director Paul Brickman, and actor Tom Cruise." So that's a great combination. Really, really great. 2008, so it's already a kind of archival commentary track, but that's okay. That's not a problem at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It's really great to have this commentary track. They have there's a wonderful working relation. They really they're sitting down and they're being very friendly with each other. It's a casual conversation, and a lot of things come up. For instance, John Abnett and Paul Brickman talk about the origins of this film. How it was eventually made. There's a lot of uphill battles and trying to convince people. A lot of the people that they first went to try to get this made or produced weren't buying it. And so ultimately they found their salvation in the form of David Geffen and David Geffen's pictures. And so, David Geffen was very open and very respectful of their process, and especially when it came to casting. Casting was also one of the great pre-production adventures and legends of this film. How they ended up with the great cast that they did, including Rebecca De Mornay and Tom Cruise. But apparently, according to John Abnett and Paul Brickman, David Geffen really gave the artists a lot of breathing room and time make sure that they got the casting right, because everyone knew that if they got the casting right, then that would be just perfect, absolutely perfect. That's what it needed. So they needed to be sure that not only did they cast the right people, but also that they had good chemistry with each other. And so that we'll talk a little bit about that with the other supplements later. But this is alluded to in this, and then they go through a really nice methodical. I mean, as they watch the film, a kind of shot by shot commentary, and so they talk, for instance, how as the film opens, it has a very quite provocative, almost risque. Uh, way of opening, a kind of dream or fantasy montage sequence. I mean, I should say up front before I go on, this film isn't for everyone. I mean, no film is for everyone, but this film isn't for everyone. There are a lot of adult themes that are maybe, or mature themes that are considered here. There's some sexual intimacy, also that's both alluded to and also explicitly shown. So there's a kind of maybe the material might not necessarily be for everyone, but uh, uh, maybe that's also my way to then address the point that's brought up in the commentary, that they really try to go for something that was really it was doing something that was quote unquote maybe doing many things at once. And so it was exploring sex, it was exploring the characters' carnal lusts and desires, which is a very human feeling or human impulse or human sort of attribute to have, and it's certainly the attribute that the character Joel had and his friends, and in many ways that was one of the ways in which the film's plot propels itself forward. A kind of sexual drive that compels the characters to move to one particular place, or to pursue another goal or location or idea or person, etc. So there are other ways in which the pursuits are engendered, but that's one thing. So, and they use the opportunity here to talk about how the script may or may not have differed from the ultimate version. I think the opening was an example where it wasn't so much of a difference or divergence between what was initially written in the script and then what was ultimately shot. And then, too, the idea of Tom Cruise and his performance, and the very famous thing of his dancing. They do mention there's a bit where, as I say, he jumps on the couch, and so they talk about, I remember when I jumped on the couch, and so I always get a kick out of that. For those who know, like Tom Cruise and couches and Oprah, but in any event, that's a cool moment. It's a really great moment in the film, and there's even before that, there's a way in which his character is trying to eat a frozen dinner. Which is like it's such a ludicrously absurd and funny scene. And then also working with the camera, and that's another thing too about this is there are so many, I think, sudden movements of camera that feel very almost avant-garde, which is quite fascinating. And then it's actually commented upon a little bit later in one of the other supplements. I think it's one of the making of documentaries, but one of the inspirations I think John Abnett and Paul Brickman and others cite is, for instance, the Bertolucci film The Conformist, in trying to capture a kind of use of almost extreme primary colors, or the way in which the camera foreground or the background seems to be almost out of sync with each other on purpose, or extreme close-up images, and then some sudden bursts of almost a volatility in camera movements. So you get a lot of that in Risky Business, a lot, which is it's remarkable. I never noticed that when I first saw the film way back in the day. But now when I see it, and I have a little bit more of, I've seen a little bit more other films that might have been cited here, but I can see a sort of parallel, which is fascinating. Again, the invisible hand of Paul Brickman's cinematic art really comes to shine. And again, it's just examples of some of those details that I was never able to catch before, and still, I'm still learning as I go along. But It's really, really great. And then, too, just some of the idiosyncratic choices that were made alongside this is, and I say there's a scene involving when Joel's trying to go into the school. He goes through a door and it's always locked. He has to go through another door. So it's a comic bit. It's a sort of a bit of maybe like almost surrealism, absurdity, and it's almost a kind of extension, a commentary about school life, and maybe by extension, sort of authoritarian rigidity that he's essentially trying to break free from, and he's also trying to find an alternative way. If he can't go through the door in the middle, how he's gonna, he has to find an alternative. So that's in a sense a kind of its own entrepreneurial metaphor for entrepreneurialism. And then talking about, let's see, there's a very famous scene involving, there's so many famous scenes. There's a scene involving the living room and old time rock and roll, and then the whole dance number that he does there, and then also the scene involving the dock and the car. There's a very famous scene in what happens to a very expensive car, Porsche. The Porsche, right? And then there's also a scene involving Lana and Joel on a train, and Phil Collins. I mean, it's a very sexy scene. It's a very sensual scene. It's also it's a scene about liberation and ultimate connection. And then using the train system, the Chicago train system. It's almost like. I know they didn't mention it, but it's like they're borrowing from a very famous train sequence. The way that trains and sex are merging in, say, a film like Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. It has a similar kind of vibe to it, which is really quite cinematically genius. Um, and let's see. Oh yes, just there are a lot of driving scenes. Driving the Porsche. Some of the logistics of filming and driving scenes. Also, the sort of overlap in the context of the story here. There's the direct story of Lana and Joel, how they meet, or Ralph or Joel, how they meet, and sex work, and then how that turns into its own business model enterprise, and then how that becomes also a sort of macro commentary on Reaganomics and capitalism in the early 80s. And also you throw into the fold Joe Pantoliano's character, which is another great performance. That's another Joe Pantoliano film, by the way, that's entering into the Criterion Collection Physical Media Catalog in 2024. Earlier in the year, we had a film which is called Bound, which is great. But anyway, so that's also part of the discussion here. Rebecca De Mornay's performance, oh, it's again, it's utterly sublime, so great. That's also part of it. And then at the ending, they speak here about the ending, and the commentaries with regard to the theatrical release. So I think they do voice the idea that the ending that was originally intended is not what we have as far as the ending of the theatrical release, and they do express how the theatrical release ending does end on a very different note than the director's release version, which is, I suppose, one of the great treats of this Criterion release, in that we are now able to watch almost hand in hand or side by side either version that we choose. So, but in any event, that's the commentary accompanying the theatrical release version, the commentary from 2008, accompanying the theatrical release version for Risky Business. It's great, absolutely great. So it's nice to hear Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is very mellow. He's very friendly, and he doesn't, what is that phrase? He doesn't spill any tea or anything. Like, he's very polite and he's very friendly. I think that's sort of the in keeping with the kind of that public persona of not Paul. I was thinking of Paul Newman, because I had Tom Cruise and Paul Newman, another great '80s film called The Color of Money, in my head. So, but that's another great film, by the way. Tom Cruise and his physicality. I mean, I don't know if it's getting if he gets enough praise for that. If he does, it's great. If not, I hope he gets more. But he's really a physical actor. Really. Again, as I mentioned, side by side with Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, or Howard Lloyd, and then Jackie Chan, things. It's really quite remarkable. So anyway, it's a great commentary track, so please check it out if you can. Again, the commentary track accompanying the theatrical release version, which you can find playable either on the 4K disc or the Blu-ray disc. And then, so now let us turn our attention to the supplements which are found accompanying this Criterion release. Once again, if you're going to search out or seek out the supplements in this release, you're going to turn to the Blu-ray disc. The 4K UHD disc does not have supplements, the supplement menu, so you're going to go to the Blu-ray disc, which is again what I still have in the machine. And so I'm going to go down to the supplements menu and then press this, and it will give us a number of supplements that pop up here. A number of which I think have come over from previous non-Criterion releases, which is really great. But some of them I think are new. But in any event, let's talk about what they are. So the first one is "The Dream is Always the Same: The Story of Risky Business," and I press it, and it says, and I quote, "In this 2008 documentary, director Paul Brickman, actors Tom Cruise and Rebecca De Mornay, and other key collaborators share anecdotes about the making of Risky Business." Another very cool one. This is approximately 30 minutes, and it covers similar terrain that we saw in the similarly situated 2008 commentary track. So it's a great, it is a great supplement to that, or complement to that. This is a film. It was coming out in an age of teen comedies and sex comedies. Great. It was a great period for teen comedies and sex comedies, and I'm a big fan of the genre. So I think the one that was cited most was a film which is called Porky's, the idea is that maybe capitalizing off of the success and the profitability of that type of film at that time, but also wanting to do something in his own way. Paul Brickman came up with this story, and when he was trying to shop it around, none of the major studios would take it. But then, as I mentioned, David Geffen was the person who really believed in the work and was able then to support it in that way. And then they were off and running. So it's just a matter of trying to find who would fill the shoes of these roles. And they talk about Rebecca De Mornay, and Rebecca De Mornay, I think this is her first foray into feature film acting, according to something that she says here or elsewhere. But and then Tom Cruise, they mentioned how he was at the time shooting the film The Outsiders, which is a film directed by Francis Ford Coppola. And then he had the opportunity to audition and screen test. And also the thing too is that I think they were emerging, or Tom Cruise emerged rather late in the casting process, so they didn't find their Joel until rather late. But when they did, of course, the rest, as they say, is history, the stuff of legend. And also they tested the two of them together in a screen test to see if they would really work together in terms of on-screen chemistry. And the screen test, together with some other informative materials, is also found in one of the other supplements. So, in short, it turned out great. And no looking back. There were some great shot composition choices, setup challenges as well that were discussed there. There's a sort of a sex scene or sexy scene involving the two of Joel and Lana together. As I mentioned, they have to embrace, and Lana has to undress while keep maintaining a pose, and it has to be, their camera moves in, and wind is blowing, and the lights like this, and doors open, and all this stuff, and they have to maintain the illusion of sexual intimacy and the like. And so there's a certain degree of sex in this film. And I think Tom Cruise says that when he was still 19, under 20 years old, so still a kind of late teenager, and still very much his career was just about to really come out of the gates like this, but he was already kind of an established actor, but just huge superstar success would be knocking at his door. But he says he saw this film with his mom and his grandmother, and so he felt kind of embarrassed when some of the sex scenes came up. But they said, it was okay. It turned out great, and it was really artistically done, and like, and just working with Rebecca De Mornay was really wonderful. So, according to him, so. And then just other things, as I mentioned, some of the iconic scenes, the dock scene, what they had to do with that. I think there's a kind of a logistics mishap that caused a certain delay, and they had to work overtime to try to fix something about the dock scene and the positioning of the camera. It's also the camera work, I should mention, which is another kind of key component of this. And so just having and there were and Paul Brickman being relatively inexperienced in terms of film directing, still having to work with the challenges of sort of the studio system, a number of directors of photography, as you mentioned. It's still being holding steadfast and true to what he wants to tell, the story that he wants to tell, which is absolutely great. And he had the support of John Avnet and others there, so, and Tom Cruise, obviously, so it's great. Tangerine Dream, what they had to do to get Tangerine Dream. I think there's some discussion. I think about, it's mentioned a little bit later in one of the other supplements, but let me just mention it now. I think the idea of they filled the scenes with what's known as temp music or temporary music. So they just filled it in the sort of production phase. In order with just music that they chose, with the notion that they would replace it with some official soundtrack music later. But I think the temp music that they chose was Steve Reich and minimalism music. But they wanted to have something that had that same drive, but also a kind of almost a prog rock upbeat tempo, and that's where they really wanted to go for Tangerine Dream. So anyway, I think that comes out in the is it the Richard Chu discussion. Yes, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but in any event, this is great. 30 minutes of, again, wonderful cinematic anecdotes and displays, and you hear from Tom Cruise and Rebecca De Mornay and others, of course. So 30 minutes, fantastic. Again, this is a 2008 documentary, so it's coming from another source, but there's nothing wrong with that. I'm so glad it's being included in here. So that's the first supplement here. Next one is John Avnet, who's the producer. And it says, in this interview conducted by the Criterion Collection in 2024, producer John Avnet talks about his collaboration with director Paul Brickman. This is awesome. Really, really awesome. This is approximately 21 minutes. Here he talks about some of the props that he had, like the egg, which is cool. Also his relationship, his working professional relationship with Paul Brickman, how it ended up coming to be in the first place. John Avnet also had aspirations at one point to be himself a writer, but it didn't quite work out, and so he ultimately fell into the mode of producer, and then he also was admiring the writing craft of Paul Brickman, and then wanted to support Paul Brickman with his directorial effort of Risky Business, and so that started that professional working relationship. And so they mentioned too, and this is where I think, and again, I didn't realize this until I heard this interview with John Abbott. So there are a lot of references to, for instance, Bertolucci's The Conformist. And The Conformist is one of those, that's another landmark film in another way, in many other ways, but it's the fact when John Avnet cited The Conformist, and there's some shots like of leaves on the grass and just people walking in the sort of angle, and then sudden bursts of color, and it really came to be, there's a lot of parallels, so which I never thought about, never considered, never recognized or identified, but then it became such a fun exercise to then watch the film again and then try to catch as many of the references as I could. It's really great. And then he does talk about this film as being, it was at first hard to sell, which is why they had to shop around major studios before they ended up getting the great support from David Geffen and company. But it was hard because I think in John Avnet's point of view, and I referred to this earlier, this was the period where a lot of teen sex comedies were really riding high, I think, on the success of films like Porky's and Porky. What is it? I love those. So Porky's 2 the Next Day, and they came a little bit later, and then Porky's Revenge. I'm actually a big fan of Porky's and Porky's 2 the Next Day, but anyway, yeah. Anyway, so Porky's. But in any event, the point is that the film is also doing things or I mean, there's nothing against, not to take a knock against, say, like, great classics like Porky's or anything like that, but Risky Business is doing things that are in the same lane, but also doing things that are in a slightly different lane, or perhaps in a quite different lane. And so in that way, it probably took studios off guard, or sort of off balance, and wasn't quite what they were looking for in terms of hitting that same genre sweet spot, in a manner of speaking. So, but David Geffen was different, and so as I say, the rest was history, because it was a perfect union. And in that way, it is, as John Avnet says, it is a coming of age story in the 80s. It's a sex comedy that's taking into consideration freedom, and being the parents are away, so let's come out to play in the form of Tom Cruise's Joel, and also being 80s, and this focus on, I mentioned the entrepreneurial spirit, but also corporate profit. It is about the profit motive after all. And transactions, how things are remedied via the transaction. Is it the trust motive or the profit motive, or is it a bit of both, or are they one and the same? I mean, and this kind of thing happens. I mean, we think about this as an 80s film, and it is an 80s film, but this kind of thing, this kind of consideration happens like on a daily basis. I don't know. It's quite, even now in 2024. So there isn't that, it's an 80s film, but there's also the sense of immediacy, which I was trying to describe earlier, which is fantastic. And then also, John Avnet talks about other things too, like theory versus fact, theory versus practice, do or teach. I think that's the thing. So, and then he talks about the ending too. The ending, which does come up a lot, the difference in ending, what was planned versus what ended up having to be in the theatrical release, why that had to be the case, etc. So, but fascinating conversation with the producer John Avnet. So please check this one out if you can. This is approximately 21 minutes. Okay. Next we have Richard Chu and Bobby Osteen. This is another great one. And it says, in this interview, conducted by the Criterion Collection in 2024, editor Richard Chu and film historian Bobby Osteen discuss the decisions behind specific sequences in Risky Business. This is approximately 30 minutes. This is so fascinating. Again, like many other things, my discovery of many new things for me is occurring with my exploration of the Criterion release, and some editing choices too. Richard Chu being the editor, and Bobby Osteen is asking him a lot of questions, also expressing her admiration for this film. Again, she calls it an edgy film, mentioning The Conformist, also mentioning The Graduate, which is another great parallel. This is very much like The Graduate. Tom Cruise almost looks like, there's a similarity between him in terms of look and visage, even close-ups, a striking resemblance to Dustin Hoffman. And it reminds me too of the great pairing of Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman a little bit later in the 80s in a film called Rain Man. But in any event, they do talk about some of the rhythm choices and editing choices. They talk about specific scenes and also the general feeling of the film. So specific scenes as examples are the train scene, which is a little bit later, and what Richard Chu did. And what he proposed is to try to embellish it in terms of what he had in like, there were shots of passing trains that were already there, but then how could he use that to his advantage to sort of embellish the scene, and how that transformed the scene in terms of what Joel and Lana did via the build-up and what they had to do with the other passengers, and that became its own little mini story, which was created in this kind of organic process of back and forth. And Paul Brickman was very open to that, so that kudos to everyone involved in that, because as he mentions, the script was rather spare, giving room for a lot of, say, freedom of not improvisation per se, but building. Which is what they did. And Richard Chu mentions, there's references obviously to The Conformist, but he also mentions references, it felt like something out of Antonioni, which I thought was really great, the idea of space and context. But and then Phil Collins, In the Air Tonight, and the use of what he calls step printing frame rates, different frame rates. It's some like a flutter effect, slowing down the action. in a kind of shutter speed slow motion effect, which is really cool. And then there's also a bit, which I never noticed it, but there's a bit like a spark on one of the train lines that ends the sequence, and they talk about how that was like just a bit of serendipity. It just was a perfect way to end the sequence. And this goes into some discussion about the music and sound effects, and the mention to how the minimalism music choices for the temp tracks, Steve Reich, etc. But then that turned into Tangerine Dream, and how they really had to get Tangerine Dream in order to it had this uplift to it while having this minimalist prog rock beat to it, which is the great essence of Tangerine Dream, among other things. So and then too, talking about subjective POV shots versus the objective camera capturing of Tom Cruise's Joel. Sometimes we see it from his perspective, almost like a distancing effect between him and his parents, for example. And then also we see it from his point of view. Then it cuts to like when he's in the airport, and then suddenly cuts to this huge close up of a tall glass where he's pouring scotch in with like soda. So, and then the Bob Singer scene. Again, a classic scene. Also, driving scenes are there. Also, the mentioning about the Porsche scene and with the dock, with a very famous scene about that. And then the ending to what went about in terms of the ending. And there's a cool thing here about which Bobby Osteen mentions, how in the opening credits it's like, and I didn't think of this before until I heard this, but Tom Cruise's name is mentioned in large print, and Rebecca De Mornay's name is featured in large print, and then there's like it's the editor Richard Chu. And she's saying, "Oh, that's amazing how you get such a prominent credit at a great timed place of the opening credits." And so it's really great. Kudos to Richard Chu. It reminds me of like some very interesting placement of of credit sequences, like the end credit sequence of David Cronenberg's The Fly, in terms of the special effects by this, or the music by Bernard Herrmann in the opening credit sequence of Psycho. It's music by Bernard, and then it says directed by Alfred Hitchcock. So the placement of these credits is really it's really quite important. I understand. So anyway, it's very cool. So Bobby Osteen, Richard Chu and Bobby Osteen here talking about Richard Chu's experiences with this film, Risky Business. So 30 minutes of sheer cinematic discussion bliss. So please check it out if you can. Next is Nancy Klopper. This is another great one. In this interview conducted by the Criterion Collection in 2024, casting director Nancy Klopper talks about the search for the cast of Risky Business. This is approximately 18 minutes. Now, again, I am learning so much. I don't know the ins and outs of the casting director industry. So to hear from the casting director of Risky Business, who was then responsible to find the people that would then be chosen for the various roles in this film, among whom are people like Bronson Pinchot and Rich Mazur and Curtis Armstrong and Rebecca De Mornay and Tom Cruise. And so in many ways it's like, and she talks about what her role is and how she views her role as a casting director, and the casting director's role, and how maybe there could be some misconceptions about the apparent maybe what does the casting director do, that kind of question, etc. But the role is very important, and she also acknowledges a little bit later about how there's a lot of a great attention now being given to the casting process, not least of which is being shown by, for instance, I think the Academy Awards will be offering a casting related Oscar category. So starting, I think, 2025, apparently. So that's a great way to show recognition for this important process. And Nancy Klopper then does talk in the interview about some of her background, where how she was essentially being like an apprentice to other great casting directors that she worked under, and worked and participated through some of her own maybe famous films like The Rose, from Bette Midler's The Rose, for instance. But then she wanted to, an officer and a gentleman, etc. But then she wanted to really establish her own casting agency, I suppose, or do it in her name. So really wanting to, and then she found a lot of fresh faces in the casting process. And also, she was young at the time when she did Risky Business. I think she says she was 23 or 24 at the time. So she felt a lot of pressure, but it came out wonderfully. And then talking to about trying to guess Joel and Lana was really difficult. Until rather late in the process, they discovered Tom Cruise, and Tom Cruise came again from shooting The Outsider, so Tom Cruise had to try to make an excuse to Coppola to sort of take some time off enough to do the audition here. And also, I had to cast Lana, and then she says that she was able to ask Harry Dean Stanton, who also was working on a Coppola film called One from the Heart, and Harry Dean Stanton, according to her, mentioned that there was an extra who was working on that he thought would be really a good choice for Lana, and that was Rebecca De Mornay. So very cool indeed. So for these and other reasons, I think, and so the importance of the casting director's role and Nancy Kloppers here, without question, leading to really legendary results. So this is great. Again, what did I say? Approximately 18 minutes. So please check that one out if you can. That's really wonderful. Then screen tests. So this is approximately 15 minutes total, and it says this short program features screen tests with actors Tom Cruise and Rebecca De Mornay. So actually, it's a screen test, but it's also like some interviews before that to build up to the screen test. So like with Amy Heckerling, actually, a filmmaker, Amy Heckerling, as well as Tom Cruise and Rebecca De Mornay, as a kind of introduction to what the screen test was. It's a videotape screen test. So and I think this program, it's taking. I think it's, and I'm assuming it's also from the group of 2008, circa 2008 supplements that were carried over to this Criterion release. So in any event, it's very cool. I actually get the screen test. It's a videotape screen test, and in a house, and then I think the scenes comprise mostly of the scenes rather early in the film. There's some moments where they break out of character and they talk a little bit. It's very cool, but you can definitely tell that the chemistry, on-screen chemistry between De Mornay and Cruise, it's fantastic. So approximately 15 minutes. So this is really great. And then last but not least, we have the trailer, which is the period trailer for this film. So a lot here in terms of the supplements. I think it's really cool package, plus the commentary tracks. So this is what I like to see. It really, there's some stuff that's new from the Criterion Collection. There's also some great things that are taken from other places, including the great commentary track. So I think all in all, a great balance and a lot here. So well done for being able to do this. I'm very, very impressed. And let us now conclude our conversation, or begin to wind down our conversation on the Criterion release of Risky Business, and just end with some additional comments about the packaging and the contours of the physical media release, etc. So here, a note about the image that's chosen for the cover art, as well as the font of Risky Business in that now iconic pink or dark pink cursive writing on the bottom there, with the back of the casing here. It's also a plastic case with 2 discs. There's a for the 4K disc and the Blu-ray disc. The artwork choices here also are translated into this fold-out poster, which is, I say, fold out into what is this is to me the kind of the poster design for Risky Business, what I'm used to. So it's really great. Production credits, it says here, art directors Eric Schulman, Sarah Habibi, illustration Jeremy Anicio, and designer Eric Schulman, art production coordinator William Breeze, and then Julie Sussman, art assistant. So very nice indeed. Then we have to go to the fold out here. So it's a poster art, but I'm not a fan of the poster because it kind of I mean, I like posters. If anything, I wouldn't have mind having a separate poster as an insert, and then having yet a separate insert which would have had the credits and the essay. That would have been really cool. But this kind of, what is it? It's a poster, but if you want to put it on your wall, then you can't read the essay. I mean, at least in printed form. I guess you could if you went online, but my point is that it kind of defeats the purpose in one way, having a poster. But I understand what they're trying to do. But if they're going to do poster, I wish they could have done at least a separate poster bit. And I always feel that way when I see this. But oh well, no matter. Again, it's very, very, very small criticism at the end of the day. But here we have on the back the Coming of Age in Reagan's America essay by Dave Kerr, which is very, very great. I've read it a number of times, and it's very insightful. And there's some links to he makes some links to other films. I mean, we mentioned The Conformist, The Graduate. There's also Hitchcock references that he mentions here. There's a Hitchcock allusion that he makes in terms of concluding shots. It's, what does he say? It's like Hitchcock's The Birds, which I when I read that, I thought that was really, really fascinating. So, but in any event, going into so much detail about the film thematic concerns and also sort of political, social, political context in ways. So please watch the film first, and then you can read the essay that's on the back here of the poster insert. And then it goes to the left-hand side like this, and then there's the pink colored disc, which is the 4K disc, and then the blue colored disc. Let me just show that. There you go. That's the black color disc, I'm sorry, which is on the back here. That's the Blu-ray disc. So different colors for the discs, which I always appreciate whenever I get that. So, okay, Risky Business. It's now in the Criterion Collection physical media catalog. Go check it out if you're interested. It's certainly worthwhile. As I said, one of the great landmark films of the 80s for many reasons, and then some. This is the Paul Brickman film, which is Risky Business. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great movies, including Risky Business, including other works by Paul Brickman, including other films in the Criterion Collection and beyond. So until we see each other again, my dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.